The aboriginal territory of the Schitsu'umsh was a vast and bountiful domain, encompassing nearly 5 million acres across what is now northern Idaho, eastern Washington, and western Montana. This expansive homeland stretched from the southern end of Lake Pend Oreille in the north, along the Bitterroot Range of Montana to the east, south to the Palouse and the North Fork of the Clearwater River, and west to Steptoe Butte and the area just east of Spokane Falls. At the heart of this world was, and is, Lake Coeur d'Alene, a body of water central to their physical and spiritual existence. This was not a barren wilderness, but a rich mosaic of interconnected ecosystems. It included dense forests of fir, ponderosa pine, and cedar, a network of pristine freshwater rivers such as the Coeur d'Alene, St. Joe, Clark Fork, and Spokane, numerous lakes including Coeur d'Alene, Pend Oreille, and Hayden, and fertile rolling prairies like the Palouse covered in perennial bunchgrass. This ecological diversity provided an extraordinary abundance of resources. The waters teemed with trout and other fish, the forests were home to deer, elk, and bear, and the meadows and wetlands yielded a rich harvest of camas roots, berries, and water potatoes. This natural wealth meant that from an indigenous perspective, the Schitsu'umsh were an exceptionally prosperous people with everything they needed close at hand. More profoundly, the Schitsu'umsh worldview does not see the land as an inanimate collection of resources to be exploited. Instead, the homeland is a living entity, a sacred realm where plants, animals, and the very features of the landscape are imbued with spirit and agency. The relationship between the people and the land is one of deep reciprocity and sacred trust. According to tribal belief, the Creator placed the Schitsu'umsh in this specific place to be its caretakers and guardians. This role is a covenant. As the people care for and respect the land in turn cares for and provides for the people. This spiritual ecology forms the bedrock of the Schitsu'umsh identity and continues to inform their actions as a modern sovereign nation. The societal structure, moral code, and legal framework of the ancestral Schitsu'umsh were not recorded in written documents, but were encoded and transmitted through a complex and powerful body of oral traditions. These stories are not fables or myths in the Western sense. They are a living charter for existence, a moral and ecological constitution that defines the proper relationships between the human, natural, and spiritual worlds. According to these traditions, before the arrival of human peoples, the world was inhabited by powerful beings known as the animal peoples or the first peoples. Among the most prominent of these figures were Coyote, a classic trickster whose actions could be both creative and foolish, Crane, who embodied the essential virtue of sharing, and Chief Child of the Yellow Root, a heroic figure who prepared the world for humanity. The actions of these first peoples shaped the physical and moral landscape. Chief Child of the Yellow Root traveled Lake Coeur d'Alene, slaying monsters and transforming dangerous beings into helpful tools for the humans to come. Coyote, in one of his helpful moments, released the salmon trapped at Steptoe Falls, ensuring a vital food source would be available, and in another, tricked a great monster rock into chasing him into the lake, thereby creating the surrounding mountains and prairies and giving the lake its characteristic blue color. These traditions serve to establish the core ethics of the Schitsu'umsh society. The story of Crane, who hunted deer and unselfishly gave the venison to starving villagers, is not just a tale, but a foundational precedent establishing the law of generosity and the importance of caring for those in need. Conversely, Coyote's frequent failures, which often resulted from his own selfishness and trickery, served as cautionary tales against greed and arrogance. The oral traditions culminate in the creation of the various human peoples, including the Schitsu'umsh, from the body parts of a great gobbler monster that Coyote had tricked and killed. Then the Creator placed each of these newly formed peoples in their respective homelands, with the Schitsu'umsh being placed at the heart of the lake country. The act of retelling these stories, particularly during the long winter nights, was a powerful and performative ritual. It was believed that the spoken word had an animating power, and that in the telling, the world described was brought forth and renewed, reinvesting the land with its sacred gifts. This understanding reveals the profound devastation caused by the later suppression of the Schitsu'umsh language and the banning of traditional ceremonies by missionaries and the U.S. government. This was not merely an attack on culture, but a direct assault on the Schitsu'umsh legal, moral, and philosophical universe. Consequently, the tribe's modern language and cultural revitalization efforts are not simply preservation projects. They are acts of constitutional and spiritual restoration, aimed at breathing life back into the very foundation of their world. Unlike many plains tribes, the Schitsu'umsh were not nomadic. They were a settled people who lived in approximately 35 semi-permanent winter villages established along the shores of the Coeur d'Alene, St. Joe, and Spokane rivers. Their lives were governed by a sophisticated and sustainable place-based economy, following a well-established seasonal round that maximized the use of their rich environment. Their social and political organization reflected a fundamentally egalitarian ethos. The Schitsu'umsh society was organized into 3 loosely structured bands, corresponding to the primary winter village locations, but the core social unit was the extended family. There were no hereditary clans, no rigid class structure, and slavery was not practiced. Kinship was traced bilaterally, meaning that relatives on both the mother and father's sides were considered equally important. Leadership was not inherited or coercive. Headmen and chiefs were chosen by consensus, based on their wisdom, persuasive ability, and demonstrated generosity. They led by example, and public opinion was the primary mechanism of social control. The most severe sanction for offenses was exile. Women held significant influence, speaking freely at public gatherings and shaping community decisions. The ancestral world of the Schitsu'umsh, stable for millennia, began to undergo profound and irreversible changes with the arrival of new influences from the outside world. This period was marked by a cascade of crises, where each new pressure compounded the last, systematically leading to the dispossession of the people. The introduction of the horse altered their economy and brought new conflicts. The arrival of traders and missionaries introduced devastating diseases that caused a massive population collapse, severely weakening their ability to resist the subsequent wave of military invasion. This military subjugation then forced them into a coercive treaty process that stripped them of the vast majority of their land base. This was not a series of isolated events, but a clear causal chain of colonization. The first major change was the arrival of the horse around the 1760s. Reintroduced to the continent by the Spanish, the horse revolutionized Schitsu'umsh transportation and economy. It eased travel for the seasonal round, and most significantly, allowed hunting parties to journey east into the buffalo country of Montana. These trips were viewed as grand adventures and important rites of passage for young men. But they also brought the Schitsu'umsh into more frequent and intense conflict with plains tribes like the Blackfeet. The influence of these journeys led to the adoption of some plains cultural traits, such as the hide teepee, which began to replace their traditional tule mat lodges. The next wave of newcomers arrived in the early 19th century. In 1809, David Thompson of the British Northwest Fur Trading Company established a post nearby, initiating direct trade with Europeans. It was during this era that French-speaking Iroquois and Canadian trappers, impressed by their sharp negotiating skills, gave them the name Coeur d'Alene. The fur trade brought new material goods like guns, metal tools, and cloth, but it also introduced new dependencies and the destructive influence of alcohol. Following the traders were the missionaries, in an event that seemed to fulfill a prophecy made by the 17th century chief Circling Raven about the coming of black robes. Jesuit priests arrived in the region. In 1842, Father Pierre-Jean Desmet made contact with the tribe, and this led to the establishment of the Mission of the Sacred Heart. The original mission building, now known as the Cataldo Mission, was constructed with Schitsu'umsh labor between 1843 and 1853 and stands today as the oldest building in Idaho. The relationship with the Jesuits was complex. They introduced Catholicism and European-style agriculture, and for a time the Coeur d'Alene became renowned as successful farmers. However, the missionaries also pursued an aggressive assimilationist agenda. They actively sought to suppress traditional spiritual practices like the Schitsu'umsh vision quest and the winter medicine dances, burned sacred medicine bundles, and established a harsh boarding school system where children were forbidden to speak their language, Schitsu'umsh, under the explicit policy to kill the Indian, save the man. The most devastating impact of contact was biological. Waves of infectious diseases to which the indigenous peoples had no immunity swept through the region. Smallpox epidemics, particularly in 1831, 1847, and 1850, were catastrophic. The Schitsu'umsh population plummeted from an estimated 5,000 in the pre-contact era to as low as 500 by the mid-19th century. This great dying was more than a loss of life, it was a collapse of their society, erasing generations of collective knowledge, disrupting social and economic structures, and severely weakening their ability to defend their homeland from the growing pressure of American expansion. As miners and settlers began to encroach upon their lands in the 1850s, tensions escalated into open conflict. In May 1858, a U.S. Army column of 150 soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Steptoe marched into Schitsu'umsh territory without permission. A combined force of Schitsu'umsh, Spokane, Palouse, and other allied warriors confronted and decisively defeated the American troops in what the tribes call the Battle of Twahotanimi. It was a stunning victory, but it would prove to be short-lived. The U.S. Army responded with overwhelming force. Colonel George Wright led a larger, better-armed expedition with the explicit goal of punishment. Wright's forces defeated the tribal alliance in several engagements and then implemented a brutal, scorched earth policy designed to break their ability to resist. He ordered the destruction of vast quantities of stored food, and in a particularly devastating act, commanded the slaughter of some 900 of the tribe's horses, crippling their economy, mobility, and wealth. Wright then lured several tribal leaders into his camp under the pretense of peace talks and had them summarily hanged without trial at a site along a creek that subsequently became known as Hangman Creek. The conflict concluded on September 17, 1858, with the signing of a coercive Treaty of Peace and Friendship. Under duress, the Schitsu'umsh leaders were forced to agree to cease hostilities, surrender men accused of starting the battle with Steptoe, and allow unmolested passage for whites through their country. The military defeat of 1858 left the Schitsu'umsh in a severely weakened position to negotiate the future of their homeland. The subsequent decades saw the systematic dismantling of their aboriginal territory through a series of unratified agreements and unilateral U.S. government actions that confined them to a fraction of their ancestral lands. Executive Order of 1873. On November 8, 1873, President Ulysses S. Grant issued an executive order that established the initial boundaries of the Coeur d'Alene Reservation. This act reduced their territory to approximately 600,000 acres. Though the tribe disagreed with the boundaries, the order crucially included the southern portion of Lake Coeur d'Alene and the lower St. Joe River, a fact that would become immensely important in their legal battles more than a century later. Agreements of 1887 and 1889. As pressure from settlers and mining interests continued, the U.S. government pushed for further land cessions. An agreement in 1887 and another in 1889 further reduced the reservation, with the tribe ceding vast territories in exchange for promises of compensation that were often delayed or never fully paid. These actions established the final boundaries of the reservation at approximately 345,000 acres, less than 10% of their original homeland.